Tonight we step into a world long past, where stone walls rise high and heavy, wooden doors creak on iron hinges, closing softly behind those who enter. But what happened when that door shut, when a person found themselves on the other side, waiting in darkness? That is the story we will explore together, slowly and gently, like walking through dim corridors lit only by a trembling torch. And as you drift off, tell me quietly in the comments which part of history you would like to wander through next, so that our journey can continue in the paths you most wish to see. Imagine the first breath inside a medieval prison. The air is damp and cool, thick with the smell of earth and stone dust, and perhaps the faint smoke of a torch burning low in its sconce. There is a tang of iron in the nose, as if the air itself has grown rusty from centuries of chains and bars. It is not a place designed for comfort. In truth, these prisons were often not built as prisons at all. They were cellars beneath castles, corners of towers, basements of town halls, rooms pressed into service when the need arose. Picture a chamber beneath a fortress keep, where walls so thick they could withstand a siege now stand silent around a handful of weary men. Narrow arrow slits let in only the palest grey light, enough to catch dust motes drifting slowly through the stillness. The floor is hard, sometimes packed earth, sometimes rough stone, and against one corner lies a pile of straw that serves as bedding. If you had been placed here, you would not have been thought of as serving a punishment, but in the way modern prisons are designed. Instead, you would have been kept, simply kept, until something else was decided for you. That is one of the strange things about medieval justice. To be imprisoned was not usually the end of the story, but rather a pause in it. You might be held until the next market day when the court assembled, or until your family gathered enough money to pay a debt, or until your ransom was negotiated if you were of noble birth. For the poor, however, the pause could be long and weary, filled with hunger, sickness, and uncertainty. Listen closely, and you can hear what it was like. A chain scraping against stone as someone shifts on the floor. The soft cough of another in the darkness. Water dripping rhythmically somewhere beyond sight, marking time like a slow and patient clock. And above, almost too faint to believe, the sounds of ordinary life continue. A child laughing in the market square, the clop of a horse's hooves, the bells of the parish church calling the town to prayer. Those bells were perhaps the cruelest sound of all, for they reminded the prisoner that life outside went on, bright and free, while their own world had grown small and narrow. And then there was the food, if food it could be called. In many places, prisoners had to provide for themselves. If family or friends brought food, or if they had money to pay, they might eat decently enough. But if not, they relied on the charity of others, or the meagre scraps a jailer provided. Picture a crust of coarse black bread, dense and sour, and a cup of water drawn from a wooden bucket, its taste tinged with wood and damp. Day after day the same, until hunger dulled into weariness, and weariness into silence. When night fell, the cell grew colder, the air sharpened by draughts slipping through cracks in the stone. There were no glass windows, only open slits or iron bars, and the chill of winter crept in without mercy. Many slept on bare ground, their bodies curled tightly against one another for warmth. Some had only straw beneath them, flattened and scratchy. A lucky few might bribe the jailer for a blanket or a wooden board to lie on. Yet even here sleep came. The body, no matter its hardship, always seeks rest. And so, in the dark, prisoners drifted into uneasy dreams, their breathing mingling in the stillness. The figure who moved in and out of this world was the jailer, and his presence could mean many things. He might be a gruff man with little patience, rattling keys at his belt as he strode past, or he might be weary and distracted, more interested in his own supper than the plight of those behind the door. Some jailers demanded payment for every small mercy, a coin to loosen a chain, another for a jug of ale, yet another for the loan of a blanket. Imagine paying for the shackles that bound you, and it seems strange to us now, but in those days it was part of the expected order. Others were more lenient, even kind, allowing a prisoner's family to visit more often, or turning a blind eye when food was smuggled in. Much depended on the character of the man who held the keys. In this way, each day was much the same as the one before. Morning arrived with no fanfare, only the pale light that slipped in through the wall. Prisoners stirred, joints stiff, voices rough with sleep. Some muttered prayers, others whispered gossip, still others sat in silence, staring into the shadows. Hours stretched long, filled with little more than waiting. There was no schedule, no work to pass the time. A man might carve a mark into the wall to count the days, or trace shapes in the dust with his finger. If he was fortunate, he might have a book or a scrap of parchment on which to write letters, though candles to read by were precious and rare. Most endured the dark, listening, waiting, hoping. Sometimes visitors came. A wife carrying a small parcel of food, wrapped carefully in cloth, her eyes glistening as she passed it through the bars. A mother reaching for her son's hand, whispering encouragement. Or a priest walking softly through the corridor, murmuring prayers of comfort and reminding the weary that salvation lay beyond suffering. For those moments, the prisoners remembered the world outside and felt, however briefly, a spark of warmth. Yet each visit ended the same way, footsteps retreating, the door closing, and silence filling the cell once more. Even seasons made themselves known inside. In winter, the cold bit cruelly, frost lining the walls and breath rising in pale clouds. Prisoners huddled close, sharing what warmth they could. In summer the air grew thick and heavy, hard to breathe, as though the stones themselves sweated with heat. Outside, festivals and feast days came and went, and their echoes seeped into the prison. At Christmas, prisoners might hear carols sung faintly in the square, or bells ringing louder than usual. Sometimes alms were given then, a loaf of bread, a few coins, a woolen blanket. Those small acts of charity glowed brightly in memory, like a candle that refuses to be extinguished. Yet the hardest weight to bear was not the cold or hunger, nor even the stifling air. It was uncertainty, not knowing how long the wait would last, not knowing what judgment awaited, not knowing if friends outside still remembered, or if they had quietly turned away. That uncertainty hung heavier than chains, pressing down with every passing day. This is why it truly felt so hard, so wearying to be a prisoner in the Middle Ages. Not just the discomfort, but the endless waiting, the reliance on others for even the smallest needs, and the fear of what might come next. And yet, within those walls, small human moments endured. A crust of bread shared, a whispered prayer, a flicker of kindness in the dark. Now, as you let your thoughts settle and your breathing soften, imagine the slow flicker of torchlight against the stones, the hush of voices fading into silence, and the heavy wooden door closing gently once again. Tonight we rest here, but tomorrow we will walk further into this world and see it from the eyes of the men who held the keys. And now, as you drift further into sleep, let the door close softly, and let the story continue when you are ready to dream again. The night has passed, though you would hardly know it, for morning in a prison comes without ceremony. There is no rooster crowing, no sunbeams spilling across a wooden floor, only the faintest grey light seeping through a narrow slit in the wall. One prisoner stirs and stretches, his joints aching from the hard ground. Another coughs softly, the sound muffled by the dampness that clings to the air. Slowly, the small society within these walls wakes, though wakefulness here is less a beginning than it is a continuation of the long, slow waiting that marks every day. Time in such a place does not flow quickly. It pools like still water, stretching hours into what feels like days. A man might sit cross-legged, drawing invisible shapes in the dust, listening to the slow rhythm of dripping water in the distance. Another might whisper a prayer, the words half remembered from Mass, or tell a quiet story of the village he once called home. In this dim and crowded world, strangers are thrown together, and though they come from different walks of life, they share the same uncertain fate. A farmer accused of theft might sit beside a debtor unable to pay what he owed, and across from them, perhaps, a soldier taken prisoner in some forgotten skirmish. Each waits, not knowing whether tomorrow will bring freedom, harsher judgment, or nothing at all. The air is heavy with smells that are difficult to escape. Damp stone, unwashed clothes, smoke from a torch guttering low. The sour scent of straw, long past, fresh. Medieval prisons were not known for cleanliness, and though in larger towns there were people tasked with removing waste, this was irregular, sometimes forgotten for weeks at a time. Most of the burden fell on the prisoners themselves, and so the smell became another companion, lingering like a shadow. Food, when it arrived, did little to lighten spirits. In some places a jailer might hand out scraps of bread or a thin broth, but often prisoners depended on family or friends to bring meals from outside. Those without such support faced hunger, gnawed by the emptiness in their bellies. Imagine receiving a rough loaf of bread hard at the edges and a cup of water faintly flavored with the wood of its bucket. It is enough to keep life going, but not enough to bring joy. Still, even a crust of bread shared between prisoners could become a moment of warmth, a gesture of solidarity in a place where comforts were rare. There were visitors, too, and their presence changed everything. Picture a woman approaching, carrying a small bundle wrapped in cloth, carefully folded to protect what little food she could spare. She speaks in hushed tones, reaching through the bars to place the parcel in her husband's hand. For a few moments their eyes meet, and the distance between the inside and the outside seems smaller. Or imagine a priest stepping softly down the corridor, the hem of his robe brushing the stones, his voice low and steady as he offers prayers of comfort. These visits were lifelines, fragile but vital, reminders that life beyond the walls still remembered them. Yet, when the footsteps faded, the silence that returned seemed all the heavier. Seasons revealed themselves even in confinement. In winter, the cold was sharp, the breath of each prisoner visible in pale clouds, frost forming on the stones. Men huddled close together, wrapping arms around themselves, whispering against the chill. In summer, the air grew thick and stifling, as though the very walls sweated with heat. From outside, sounds of festivals drifted faintly in. Bells ringing more brightly at Christmas, distant carols sung in the square, or the lively noise of a fair in the warmer months. On rare occasions, alms were distributed, a loaf of bread or a blanket given to those inside, a gesture of mercy that stood out like a spark against the gloom. Yet for all the discomfort, perhaps the most unbearable weight was uncertainty. Each man wondered silently, how long would I remain here? What judgment awaits me? Do my loved ones still fight for my release, or have they turned away in despair? This not knowing pressed more heavily than hunger or cold. It lingered in every sigh, every restless movement, every quiet pause. Still, even in the midst of such waiting, humanity endured. A song hummed softly in the dark, a story passed from one man to another, a crust of bread broken in two. These small acts of kindness flickered like candles, fragile but real, proof that the spirit could persist even in the most difficult of places. And as the hours passed, bells tolled faintly outside, each chime a reminder of the world continuing on. Life beyond the walls did not stop. Children laughed, merchants called out their wares, smoke curled gently from chimneys, while inside time seemed to stand still. To listen to those bells was both comfort and torment, for they connected the prisoners to life even as they reminded them of its distance. This is how the long hours were spent, waiting, enduring, hoping. And yet, always, there was the presence of the jailer, moving through the shadows with his ring of keys. He was the figure who could unlock doors, allow visitors, grant a small kindness, or impose a harsher burden. His choices shaped the prisoner's days more than anything else, for in his hands lay not only the keys to the cells, but also the delicate balance between cruelty and compassion. It is with him that we will walk next, into the life of the man who stood between the world of freedom and the world of confinement, who carried iron at his belt and bore responsibility for every sigh behind those doors. His story, too, is woven into the fabric of medieval imprisonment, and his shadow stretches as long as the walls themselves. And now, as your eyes grow heavy and your breath softens, let the bells fade slowly into silence, the footsteps retreating down the corridor. Rest here a while, and when we return, we shall follow the quiet steps of the man with the keys and see the world of the jailer as he himself might have known it. Drift deeper now, for the night is long and the story will wait for you. The sound of the corridor lingers in your imagination, the slow echo of footsteps retreating into the dark, the faint clink of keys at the belt of the man who passes through this world of shadows. If the prisoner's life was marked by waiting, the jailer's life was marked by watching, and his was a curious role balanced between duty and temptation. He was not often a man of wealth or high standing. More usually he was a simple servant of the town, or of the lord whose castle loomed above the village. The work was steady, and steadiness was precious in a world where many lived from harvest to harvest, never certain of what the next season would bring. Yet with the keys came power, and power always carried both burden and risk. Imagine him moving through the narrow passageways with a torch held high, the light catching on the iron bands of doors, on the pale outlines of faces peering through small openings. Each key at his side was a promise, the power to shut away or to release, the weight of human lives jangling softly with each step he took. Some jailers were stern, guarding each comfort as though it were gold. They demanded coins for a scrap of bedding, for a mug of ale, even for the simple mercy of loosening a chain. The poor might languish under such a man's care, while the better off fared slightly easier, for silver could soften the hardness of stone. Yet others were more lenient, perhaps weary men who saw little profit in cruelty. These might allow families to visit more often, or turn their eyes away when extra food slipped past the door. In truth, much depended on the character of the man who held the keys, and whether he looked upon the prisoners as wretches to be punished or souls to be pitied. Still, his life was not easy. The jailer lived close to the prison, often within the same walls, and so the sights and sounds of confinement were his daily companions. He heard the coughs in the night, the muttered prayers, the occasional cry of despair. He carried the smell of the place in his clothes, the mixture of smoke, damp, and human closeness. His family, if he had one, lived in the shadow of this world too, and his children might grow up hearing the sighs of men behind stone walls as the backdrop to their own play. There was danger as well. Desperate men sometimes plotted escape, and though medieval prisons were not designed like modern fortresses, the jailer knew he must be vigilant. A door left unbarred, a chain too loosely fastened, a guard too drowsy by his torch. These could mean a prisoner slipping away into the night. To prevent such things, he kept his eyes open and he listened carefully to whispers. Yet, even in his vigilance, temptation lingered, for a man with keys and little coin could be persuaded. Many a prisoner's family approached a jailer with quiet offers, a small bribe to allow extra food, to carry a message, perhaps even to turn the lock at the right time. For some, conscience held firm. For others, the lure of silver was too strong. Imagine the jailer's daily rhythm. In the morning he makes his rounds, sliding open a door to check the straw inside, handing out what little bread or broth he has been given to distribute. He notes who has visitors and who does not. He listens for quarrels, for sickness, for the shuffle of movement in the dark. His work is not hurried. It moves with the same slow pace as the prison itself, for there is little urgency in a place designed only to hold. In the afternoon he may speak with a priest who comes to hear confessions, or with a merchant delivering food. In the evening he checks the locks once more, the torchlight throwing his shadow long and thin against the walls. And at night, when silence falls over the cells, he too lies down to sleep, though sleep is never quite free of the noises that seep through stone. The sigh of a man shifting in discomfort, the distant toll of bells, the restless murmur of voices that never quite fade. What must it have been like to live always between the world outside and the world within? To walk each day through a marketplace filled with laughter and trade, and then return to the dim corridors where time stretched endlessly? The jailer's life was one of thresholds, his steps crossing back and forth, his heart pulled in two directions. And though he was not himself a prisoner, he was bound to them, his days and nights woven into theirs, his fate tied to the walls he served. In some stories, jailers are remembered with harshness, as cruel men who profited from the suffering of others. In other tales, they appear as reluctant keepers doing what they must, neither kinder nor crueler than their age allowed. But, in truth, most were something in between. Ordinary men living in an extraordinary role, carrying the weight of iron at their side, their lives shaped by the prisoners they guarded as much as by the families they returned to at night. And so, as we leave him for now, picture the jailer walking slowly through the corridor, the ring of keys tapping against his hip, the torchlight flickering on the stone. His figure grows smaller as he disappears into the dark, and once again the prison falls silent. But our journey is not done, for beyond the jailer's steps lies the wider system that gave him his place, the medieval courts, the trials, the judgments that decided who entered these cells and who would walk free. Next we will drift gently into that world, where justice was spoken aloud beneath the open sky, and verdicts carried the power to send a man either home or deeper into the shadows. And now, as you breathe a little more slowly, let the image of the jailer fade softly, his footsteps echoing into nothing. Let the silence wrap around you like a cloak. The story will wait patiently until we open it again, and for now you may close your eyes and rest. The jailer fades into the shadows, his torch sputtering out of sight, and we follow the faint murmur of voices rising from beyond the stone walls. For the prison was never the beginning of a story, only a chapter in the long path of medieval justice, and that path most often led to the open space of the marketplace or the church square, where the people of the town gathered beneath the sky. Imagine walking out into that place after the closeness of the prison, the air fresh with the smell of bread baking in ovens, the faint tang of animals in the street, and the rustle of cloth as merchants set up their stalls. In the center, a wooden platform or a bench marks the space where justice is to be spoken. In our world today, courts are enclosed, solemn and structured. But in the Middle Ages, judgment was a more public affair. The people assembled not only to hear but also to witness, for justice was seen as something belonging to the community. Picture townsfolk gathering, shawls pulled close against the breeze, children clinging to their mothers' skirts, men leaning on staves as they listen. The accused is brought forth, perhaps pale from days in confinement, perhaps still in chains, and stands before the authority of the place, a lord, a sheriff, or the appointed justices of the town. The process was not swift. Words were spoken slowly in Latin or in the vernacular, with witnesses called forward to tell their tales. Some trials were brief, simple matters of theft or debt, where the evidence was plain and the decision came quickly. Others stretched on, with oaths sworn, documents read aloud and the murmur of the crowd rising and falling like a tide. There was no separation from the people, no walls to keep their voices away. Justice was performed in their sight, part ceremony, part lesson, reminding all who listened of the order that held their world together. For many, the heart of the matter lay not only in truth, but in reputation. A man known for honesty might find his neighbors willing to speak for him, while one with a darker past might stand alone, the silence of others more condemning than any words. And though priests often reminded the gathered crowd of divine judgment, the weight of earthly decision rested on human shoulders, with all their doubts and imperfections. Punishment varied. For a debtor, repayment was sought, or a longer stay in the prison until money could be found. For a thief, fines were common, though harsher sentences were possible. Nobles taken in war might be returned for ransom, while peasants faced penalties that reflected their small means. Yet the prison remained less a punishment than a pause, a place to hold someone until the larger machinery of justice determined their fate. What must it have felt like? To stand before the crowd, the eyes of neighbors upon you, your future decided in words spoken into the open air, the weight of silence as you waited, the shifting of feet on the cobbles, the creak of wooden benches, the distant peal of a bell marking the hour. Time, once again, stretched slowly, just as it did within the prison walls, but here the waiting was sharper, edged with fear and hope entwined. Sometimes verdicts were merciful. A man might be fined and sent home, returning to his family with relief so sharp it felt like joy. Other times the judgment was less kind, and the prison door closed once more, or worse, the punishment was carried out then and there before the eyes of the town. Yet even in this there was a strange rhythm, for justice was not only about the individual but about the community's peace of mind, the assurance that order still held sway in a world often filled with uncertainty. The seasons touched this part of life too. In spring and summer, trials were held in bright daylight, with the smell of blossoms in the air, and in winter, breath rose like mist as people huddled close to hear the words. Each time, the outcome might change a life forever, sending one man home, another into the shadows of the cells, and another perhaps further still. If we listen closely now, we can almost hear the echo of such a gathering. The murmur of voices, the measured tone of the judge, the rustle of skirts, the faint sigh of wind tugging at cloaks. And then silence falls, for the decision has been made and the path of the prisoner is set. Some walk free, their relief like sunlight after a storm. Others are led back down into the earth, to the waiting air of the prison. The heavy door closes, the keys rattle, and once more the darkness becomes their companion. It is strange to think how lives turned on these moments, how the fate of a man or woman rested on words spoken in a square, on the judgment of a few, on the testimony of neighbors, or the absence of it. To us, far away in time, the system may seem uncertain, uneven, even unfair, but to those who lived it, it was the fabric of their days, the way of order in a world that might otherwise dissolve into chaos. And so the jailer had his place, and the prisoner his, and the court stood above them both, deciding the flow of their lives like a river shaping its banks. Yet beyond all this, beyond the law and its sentences, there was another presence that moved softly through the prisons of the Middle Ages, a presence not of stone or iron, but of faith. Priests, friars, and holy men entered those dim spaces with words of comfort, reminding prisoners of salvation and of a hope that could not be locked away. That is where our steps will carry us next, into the hushed prayers and whispered confessions that echoed in the dark, and the strange roll of the soul within those walls of stone. And now, as your body softens against the night and your breath falls into a gentle rhythm, let the voices of the marketplace grow faint, the sound of judgment drift away on the breeze, and the world quiet itself once more. Rest here, for tomorrow we shall step into the silence of prayer, where even in a prison cell the heart sought light. The murmur of the marketplace fades behind us, and once again the heavy air of the prison surrounds us, but this time let us listen for gentler sounds than the rattle of chains or the scrape of iron doors. Within these walls, faith found its place, just as it did in every corner of medieval life. For even here, in the darkest chambers, people looked for light, and priests, friars, and chaplains came to carry words of comfort into the shadows. Imagine a prisoner sitting in the stillness, head bent low, the straw rustling softly beneath him. The door opens not with the harsh clang of a guard, but with the quiet step of a holy man. His robe brushes against the stone, his hand carries a small book, or perhaps only a rosary of wooden beads. He kneels beside the prisoner, and in a voice low and steady he begins to pray. The sound fills the narrow cell, and for a moment the space feels less like a cage and more like a chapel, the stone walls echoing with words of hope. Faith was the rhythm of the Middle Ages, present in every season, in every ritual of life. To be imprisoned was not only to lose freedom, but also to face the weight of conscience, the fear of death, the longing for forgiveness. Priests were there to listen, to remind the prisoner that beyond earthly justice lay divine mercy, that no wall could separate the soul from God's presence. Some confessed sins long hidden, whispering in the flickering light, their voices trembling, their hearts seeking peace before sleep or sentence carried them further. At times, whole brotherhoods of friars made it their duty to visit those in prison. They sang hymns in the corridors, their voices weaving gently through the air, bringing a sense of calm where despair lingered. The words of psalms, chanted in Latin, rose like soft smoke into the darkness, and prisoners leaned toward the sound as though it were a breeze from the outside world. Even those who had no great faith still found a kind of comfort in these moments, a reminder of something larger than the stone that surrounded them. Not only priests, but family members often brought tokens of devotion into the prison. A small wooden cross, a scrap of parchment with a verse written upon it, a rosary passed through the bars. These objects were cherished, touched again and again in the silence of long nights, worn smooth by restless hands. They became companions, anchors of hope in a place where time threatened to dissolve all sense of self. And yet faith was not only a comfort, but also part of the system of justice itself. Trials often began with oaths sworn upon holy relics, and punishments were given with reminders of divine order. A prisoner might be told to repent, to seek forgiveness, and sometimes sentences were delayed so that the soul could prepare. Priests were trusted to guide men and women toward confession before their fate was sealed, reminding them that earthly suffering was not the end, but only a passage, picture if you will, the dim corridor lit by a single candle. A friar walks slowly, his shadow stretching across the wall, his lips moving in prayer. Behind the iron bars, faces turn to follow him, some filled with longing, some hardened by pride, others softened by tears. He stops, he blesses, he listens, and then he moves on, leaving behind a hush deeper than before. The jailer watches quietly, leaning on his staff, for even he knows that in these moments something beyond law and duty is at work. There were times, too, when festivals and holy days transformed the prison. At Christmas, hymns might be sung, bread shared a little more generously, candles lit in the gloom. At Easter, the promise of renewal was spoken of, and the story of the tomb that opened to light carried special meaning for those locked behind stone. These days broke the monotony of waiting, adding a rhythm of hope to the slow passage of time. Some prisoners, inspired by these visits, wrote prayers of their own, carving them into the stone with sharp bits of metal or scratching them onto wood. Words like mercy, hope, or Jesu have been found etched into ancient prison walls, surviving centuries as quiet echoes of hearts that once longed for light. They remain like whispers, still trapped in the stone, waiting for us to hear them if we listen closely enough. But not all found peace. Some wrestled with doubt, with anger at God, with despair too deep for comfort. The priests who came knew this, and their task was not always to soothe, but sometimes simply to sit, to share the silence, to remind the prisoner that even in the depths they were not wholly alone. In that too there was a strange tenderness, the quiet companionship of presence when words could not reach, and so the prison was never entirely stone and iron. It was also filled with murmurs of prayer, with candlelight, with the faint scent of incense carried in by a passing friar, with the rustle of beads slipping through weary fingers. These small threads of faith wove through the darkness like strands of gold, fragile but unbroken, binding the prisoner to a world beyond the walls. Now, as we leave this space of whispers and hymns, let the sound of soft chanting linger in your ears like waves rolling gently upon the shore. Ahead lies another layer of this world, for faith could comfort the heart, but daily life still pressed on, and the body, too, had to endure. What did prisoners eat? How did they sleep? How did they pass the endless hours? That is where we shall drift next, into the simple, slow rhythms of daily existence within the walls. For now, as your own breath falls into a steady rhythm, let the prayers fade like candle smoke, rising into the night. Rest here, in this hush, until the story stirs again. The prayers fade like smoke, and the hush of the corridor wraps itself around us once again. Yet the body, unlike the soul, cannot be sustained on hope alone. Within the walls, daily life pressed on, slow and heavy, marked by the most ordinary of things, food, rest, and the restless passing of time. Bread was the staple, coarse and dark, baked from whatever grain was cheapest. It was not the sweet, soft bread of a noble's table, but heavy loaves, sometimes hard at the edges, sometimes stale before it was even given. Alongside it came broth, thin and steaming, flavored more with water than with meat. On good days there might be beans or peas or a sliver of salted fish, its sharp tang lingering long after the meal. But hunger was a constant companion, for food was meagre, and sometimes it came only if one could pay the jailer for it. Those without coin relied on family to bring scraps, or on the mercy of townsfolk who donated to alms. Picture a prisoner holding a wooden bowl in his hands, the warmth of the broth seeping into cold fingers. He drinks slowly, savouring each mouthful, though it is little more than a whisper of nourishment. Around him others sit in silence, chewing the crust of bread, the sound of teeth against grain echoing in the stillness. For many, the act of eating was not comfort, but survival, a rhythm that marked the turning of days, a reminder that life, however narrow, still continued. Sleep, too, was shaped by circumstance. The fortunate lay on straw, thin but softer than bare stone. The less fortunate curled on the ground itself, their bodies pressed against the chill of earth or floor. Blankets were rare, often just cloaks brought from home, and in winter breath rose in misty clouds, the cold seeping into bones. Yet the body adapts, and even in such places exhaustion eventually carried men and women into uneasy rest. Dreams flickered against the darkness. Dreams of fields, of hearths, of open skies, until the clatter of a door or the call of a guard roused them once more. The hours between meals and sleep were long and slow. Some passed the time speaking quietly with companions, their voices weaving little stories to fill the emptiness. Others sat in silence, lost in thought, their fingers tracing patterns in the dust. A few carved marks into the walls, one line for each day, building up slow calendars of survival. Time stretched differently here, thick and heavy, each day blending into the next until weeks and months slipped into one another like shadows merging at dusk. And yet, even in confinement, life's small patterns continued. A cough from one cell signaled illness. A laugh, rare but possible, echoed down the corridor when someone recalled a memory of freedom. The sound of footsteps meant the jailer was near, and all fell silent for a moment, listening to hear if food, news, or visitors followed behind him. The prison was a place of waiting, but also of listening, for the smallest noises broke the monotony and carried meaning. Sometimes games emerged in the gloom. Pebbles were used as counters, scratched boards became makeshift games of chance, and even riddles or songs passed the hours. Human beings, even in the hardest of places, found ways to weave threads of imagination into their days, softening the edges of reality. A scrap of parchment, if it could be found, might be used for writing letters, prayers, or simple sketches. And those who could not write still spoke their thoughts aloud, shaping words to ease the weight on their hearts. Seasons made their presence felt as well. In summer, the air in the cells grew stifling, heavy with heat and the closeness of too many bodies. In winter, frost sometimes crept along the walls, and prisoners huddled together for warmth, their cloaks pulled tightly around them. Rain drummed against stone, seeping into cracks, filling the silence with its steady rhythm. The sound of birds in springtime, faint but clear beyond the walls, carried a bittersweet comfort. A reminder that life outside went on, fields greening, rivers flowing, while inside, time moved slowly and predictably. Visitors were the bright interruptions of this life. A family member arriving with food, a friend bringing a blanket, even a child pressing a hand against the bars. These moments lit the prisoners' days with a fleeting warmth. Words were exchanged quickly, gifts passed through with careful hands, and then the visitor was gone, leaving behind both comfort and longing. The sound of those footsteps departing was often harder to bear than the silence before. And so the cycle continued, food and sleep, waiting and listening, whispers of hope, shadows of despair. Daily life in prison was not marked by great events, but by small repetitions, each one stitching another day into the fabric of survival. For some, these days stretched only until trial brought release. For others, they stretched longer, blending into years. Yet even here, behind stone and iron, humanity endured. In laughter, in prayer, in the sharing of bread, in the quiet resting of weary bodies, life refused to vanish. And in this endurance, there was a kind of resilience, fragile yet unbroken, reminding us that even in confinement, people sought light, warmth, and meaning. Now, as you breathe deeply and softly, let the image of the prisoner lying back upon his straw settle into your thoughts. His eyes drift closed, his breath slows, and time becomes dreamlike once again. Ahead, beyond the rhythm of daily life, lies another layer of this world, the architecture of the prisons themselves, the way stone and timber were shaped to contain human lives. That is where we will wander next, into the designs of towers, keeps, and dungeons, and how these spaces shaped the lives within. For now, rest a little deeper, as though you too were lying on that straw, safe in the rhythm of breath and heartbeat, waiting for the story to stir again. The prisoner lies quietly on his straw, the faint sound of breathing filling the stillness, and as we watch him fade into uneasy sleep, our eyes begin to wander outward to the stones that cradle him. For the prison was not only a place of waiting, but also a work of human hands, built with purpose, designed to hold, and yet shaped as much by circumstance as by intention. The architecture of medieval prisons was not always grand or carefully planned. Often they were parts of castles, cellars turned to cells, strongholds made to serve double duty as both fortresses and places of confinement. Picture a tall tower rising against the sky, its narrow windows cut like slits, its walls thick with layers of stone. At its base, hidden beneath the chambers of lords and soldiers, were dark rooms carved into the rock where prisoners were kept. These spaces were less like rooms and more like hollows, with floors uneven and walls dripping with damp. Sometimes they were reached only by ladders lowered into pits, so that the prisoner descended into the earth as though into a grave. Other times a heavy wooden door opened onto a narrow corridor where one could pass cell after cell, each marked only by a barred window or a crack of light from above. Not every prison was so forbidding. In towns, the jail might be nothing more than a sturdy building near the marketplace, its upper floors used for storage, its lower ones for confinement. Windows were small, doors reinforced, but within was closer to the rhythms of the street. The voices of merchants and townsfolk carried through the shutters, and prisoners could sometimes hear the tolling of bells or the chatter of children at play. The architecture here felt less like a fortress and more like a pause, a holding place until justice could be decided. Stone shaped the mood. Within a castle dungeon, the air was heavy and still, cool even in summer, with echoes stretching through the darkness. In a town jail, timber beams creaked overhead, and the smell of cooking fires sometimes drifted in from outside. In both, the space reminded the prisoner of separation, of being enclosed while life went on beyond the walls. The builders may not have thought much of comfort, but still, each space carried its own character, its own weight. Imagine walking through one of these places with a torch in hand. The flame flickers against the stone, throwing long shadows across the floor. Iron hinges groan as doors open and close. The passage narrows, twists, and leads into chambers that feel almost forgotten by the world. The sound of your own breath becomes louder in such a place, the walls swallowing it, sending it back as a faint echo. In these chambers, space itself was part of the punishment, pressing against the mind as surely as the chains pressed against the wrists. Some prisons were designed with small courtyards or exercise yards, places where prisoners could see the sky for a short while each day. Others offered no such mercy, and weeks could pass without a glimpse of sunlight. The presence or absence of these spaces shaped the spirit. A man who could raise his face to the sun, even for a moment, carried that warmth with him into the night, while one who never saw the sky began to lose the memory of its colors. Architecture was also about power. A tower rising above the town reminded everyone who passed that authority stood watch, that disobedience could lead not only to judgment, but to confinement within those walls. Castles, with their layers of defenses, sent the same message. The prison was not only for those within, but also for those without, a silent warning built into the landscape. And yet, there were curiosities too. Some prisons were built with chapels inside, small but complete, so that worship could take place without stepping beyond the walls. Others had kitchens attached, where food was prepared not only for guards, but sometimes for prisoners of higher standing. In a few places, merchants even set up shops just outside the gates, selling to families who came to visit or to prisoners who had coin enough to send for a mug of ale or a loaf of better bread. The sound of space was as important as its sight. In narrow passages, every footstep echoed like thunder. In wide halls, silence settled like a blanket, broken only by the occasional cough or murmur. The jailer knew his building well, every creak of timber, every whisper of wind through a crack. The prisoner too came to know it, each sound marking the hours of the day, each shadow telling its own story of light shifting beyond the walls as we stand here. In this imagined space of stone and silence, let us picture the world outside again. Above the dungeon, the castle rises in layers of strength, the great hall filled with voices, the kitchens with smells of roasting meat, the armory with the clang of steel. And below it all, in the hidden chambers, lives unfold in stillness, unseen by the banquets above, unheard by the laughter in the courtyards. The architecture of the prison was both part of and apart from the life of the medieval world, a reminder of how close confinement always stood to freedom. Soon we shall drift further still, into the curious ways people tried to escape these spaces. The secret tunnels, the bribed guards, the desperate plans whispered in the dark. But for now, let the walls stand quiet around you, their stones heavy and unchanging, while your own breath moves gently in and out, free in the night air. Rest here, wrapped in the calm of stone, until the story unfolds again. The walls rise heavy and unyielding, yet no wall, however thick, can wholly silence the thought of escape. Even in the darkest chambers of the medieval prison, where straw lay scattered and the air smelled of damp stone, prisoners dreamed of freedom. And sometimes those dreams gave birth to daring plans, whispered softly in the shadows, passed from one restless soul to another in hushed tones. Imagine a man sitting close to the wall, his fingers tracing the outline of the mortar between stones. Each night, as the jailer's footsteps fade, he tests the strength of the cracks, wondering if, with enough patience, he might loosen them. With a shard of metal hidden from sight, or even with the edge of a broken bowl, he scrapes little by little so faintly that no ear might notice. The work is slow, for stone yields grudgingly, but the thought of open air keeps him steady. Days blur into weeks, weeks into months, and still he scrapes, until at last the outline of a hole appears. Whether he succeeds or not, the act itself becomes a kind of rhythm, a way to push back against the heavy stillness of captivity. Others turned their hopes toward the jailer. A man with keys and little coin was vulnerable to persuasion, and families sometimes pooled their silver to tempt him. A bribe might secure a door left unlocked, a chain fastened loosely, or a moment of absence at the right hour. Yet trust was always dangerous, for betrayal could mean harsher punishment, more chains, fewer visits. Still, the lure of freedom outweighed the risk, and whispered promises were made in the dark, carried by trembling voices full of hope. Not all escapes were born of secrecy. In times of unrest, a fire sweeping through a town, an attack upon a castle, or even a sudden riot, prisoners sometimes slipped away in the confusion. Chains were broken, doors forced open, guards distracted. For a brief moment, the prison ceased to be a cage and became simply another building caught in chaos. Men and women stumbled into the streets, hearts pounding, unsure whether freedom or recapture lay ahead. Some stories tell of tunnels dug beneath the ground, long passages slowly carved through earth with nothing more than scraps of wood or pieces of stone. Prisoners took turns carrying handfuls of dirt in their clothing, spreading it across their cells so as not to be noticed. The work was grueling, but patience was their only tool. Now and then such tunnels reached the outside world, opening into a field or even into a nearby riverbank. Imagine the joy, the disbelief of crawling through the damp earth and feeling the night breeze on your face once again. Of course, not all who escaped found safety. Guards pursued, townsfolk raised the alarm, dogs barked in the distance. Some were caught within hours, dragged back to their cells in shame. Others made it further, vanishing into forests or over hills, their names spoken only in rumor thereafter. The prison doors closed again, but whispers of escape lingered like smoke, encouraging those who remained inside to dream that perhaps, just perhaps, they too might one day find a way. Escape attempts revealed something about the human spirit, that even in the heaviest chains, the thought of freedom could not be entirely smothered. A man could be confined, but his mind wandered beyond the walls, imagining the taste of bread at his own hearth, the sound of his children's laughter, the feel of sunlight on open fields. And in that wandering, courage sparked, the courage to scrape stone, to bribe a guard, to risk the darkness of a tunnel, to run when the moment allowed. Yet, for every daring attempt, countless others remain. Most prisoners never fled, whether from lack of means, from fear, or from resignation. They listened to the stories of those who tried and failed, and they weighed their own chances. For some, the hope of trial and release seemed safer than the gamble of escape. For others, strength waned, and they accepted their lot, sitting quietly as days folded into nights. Still, the idea of escape lived on. It was a flame, small but persistent, flickering in the gloom. Even when failure was certain, the dream itself was a comfort, a reminder that life beyond the walls still existed, waiting like a distant shore. And so as we leave these shadows tonight, picture the prisoner crouched beside the wall, his hands dusty with stone, or the figure slipping silently into the dark, heart racing with the rhythm of footsteps quickening. Picture also the stillness that follows when silence returns and the cell once again holds its secrets. For beyond escape lies another story, the return of prisoners to the outside world, whether through release, ransom, or forgiveness. That, too, shaped medieval life, the way one rejoined the rhythm of village and town after passing through stone and shadow. But for now, let those footsteps fade into the night. Rest in the calm that follows, and let your breath be slow and steady, as though you yourself have reached a quiet clearing beyond the walls. The story will find you again when you are ready. The door swings open, not to admit food or the footsteps of a priest, but to release a prisoner into the light. Imagine the weight of that moment. After weeks or months of darkness, the sudden brightness of day washing across tired eyes. The air smells different too, sharp with wind, filled with sounds that had long been distant, the clip of hooves on cobblestones, the laughter of children, the market voices rising and falling like a tide. For the prisoner, these ordinary things feel strange and new, as though the world itself has been remade in their absence. Some left through the mercy of judgment, fined or pardoned, their punishment deemed sufficient. Others went free when ransom was paid, especially men taken in war, their families and lords pooling coins to bring them home. Still others were released when debts were settled, the weight of obligation lifted at last. Each walked out with a story carved into their memory, a story that followed them long after the prison door had closed behind. Returning to daily life was not always simple. Villagers might look upon a freed prisoner with sympathy, or with suspicion depending on the crime. A man imprisoned for debt might be welcome back if he returned to honest work. One accused of theft, though forgiven by the court, might still find whispers lingering behind him. The walls of prison were not easily left behind, for they clung to reputation like shadows that lengthen at dusk, and yet families often rejoiced. Picture a mother embracing her son at the edge of the square, her shawl brushing against his face as tears wet her cheeks. Picture children holding fast to their father's hands, their voices bright and eager with questions, their joys spilling into laughter that makes passers-by pause and smile. In such moments, the memory of prison dissolved, if only for a while, in the warmth of reunion. Life resumed its rhythms. Fields still needed tending, bread still needed baking, tools still needed mending. The freed prisoner, weary though he was, returned to these tasks, grateful for the simplicity of work beneath the open sky. Even the weight of toil felt lighter than the weight of silence within the walls. At night, lying once more upon familiar bedding, he listened not to the coughs and sighs of strangers, but to the quiet breathing of family nearby. And in that sound found a peace deeper than words. For some, release came not into home but into wandering. Without family to welcome them, they drifted from town to town, carrying their stories like unseen burdens. They found work where they could or lived on the kindness of others, always marked in some way by their time behind walls. Yet even in wandering, freedom meant choice. To walk where one willed, to pause when one wished, to look upon the horizon without bars or chains. There were those too who, upon leaving, carried faith more strongly than before. The prayers spoken in confinement stayed with them, shaping their days outside, reminding them of light within as well as beyond. Others carried bitterness, muttering of injustice, their trust in the world dimmed. Still, both walked the same roads, both breathed the same free air, and both felt the strange sensation of being once more among the living. Imagine walking with one of them down a narrow village lane. The cottages lean close, their thatched roofs low, smoke rising gently from hearths. Neighbours glance up from their tasks, some nodding in greeting, others turning away. Chickens scatter across the path, a dog barks in the distance, and the freed prisoner feels both comfort and unease. Everything is familiar, yet everything feels altered, as though seen through new eyes. Freedom, once taken for granted, now feels like a precious cloak wrapped tightly around the shoulders, and always there was the knowledge of how fragile it could be. A wrong step, a debt unpaid, a quarrel with the wrong man. These could lead back again to the jailer's keys, the heavy door, the silence of the cell. Perhaps that is why many who had once been imprisoned walked with more care, their voices softer, their choices weighed more cautiously. Having once tasted the absence of freedom, they cherished its presence all the more. Not all who left walked out by judgment or ransom. Some were freed when wars swept through and prisons were broken open. Others were released during great feasts or coronations, when mercy was shown in celebration. A few found their freedom through simple neglect, forgotten in the turning of records, their doors opened at last by a weary jailer who declared their time done. However it came, the first breath of air outside the walls was always the same, a reminder that life, with all its burdens, was still a gift when lived beneath the sky, and so the story of the prisoner did not end at the prison door. It continued in homes, in fields, in the quiet murmur of prayers, in the cautious steps of those who remembered stone and shadow. The medieval prison, harsh though it was, became only one chapter in the longer tale of a life, a chapter that left its mark but did not wholly define the person who had lived it. Now, as we leave this scene, let the image of reunion linger in your thoughts. The embrace of family, the laughter of children, the relief of lying down in a familiar room. Ahead, though, lies another side of the story, for not all prisons were alike. In distant lands and in other cultures, confinement took on different shapes, guided by different laws and carried out with different rhythms. Soon, we will wander into those places too, comparing how other societies imagined the idea of holding a prisoner and how those ideas touched the lives within their walls. But for tonight, let your breath fall softly, and let the feeling of freedom, fragile yet precious, be the last thought before sleep, for beyond the darkness light always waited. Far beyond the stone towers of England and France, where damp dungeons and town jails shaped the rhythm of justice, other lands carried their own ways of holding those accused or condemned. Tonight, let us journey softly into those places, drifting as though in a dream from one world to another, pausing long enough in each to feel its air, to hear its voices, to understand its differences. In the Islamic world, during the centuries we call medieval, prisons were not always the same dark holes we imagine in Europe. Many were more like houses of detention, simple and functional, built less for punishment and more for holding until judgment. Picture a courtyard enclosed by high walls, sunlight falling gently across its center, the murmur of men at prayer rising in the morning air. The prisoner here might be given space to walk, to stretch, even to speak with others under watchful eyes. Food was sometimes provided by the authorities, though often families were still expected to bring nourishment, just as in the West. The rhythm was softened by faith. The call to prayer reached even the confined, and sometimes scholars or clerics would visit, offering words of guidance and reminding both prisoners and jailers of compassion. Confinement, though heavy, was not always meant to strip away dignity. It was meant to restrain until decisions could be made, until debts could be paid, until wrongs could be addressed. And yet, just as anywhere, abuses happened, and not all spaces were so gentle. But the idea itself was shaped by a culture that saw justice as balance, mercy alongside discipline. Further east, in China, the concept of confinement stretched even further back in time. Prisons there were tied closely to bureaucracy, to careful records and officials who kept track of every soul. Picture long halls of wooden beams with rooms divided by bars, not so dark as the dungeons of Europe, but no less strict. Guards moved with authority, their voices measured, their duty part of the great machinery of empire. Here, as in so many places, families played their role, bringing food and clothing, for the state did not always supply what was needed for comfort. Yet the sense of order, of system, was strong. The prisoner was a name in a record, a mark upon a page, part of a vast structure that stretched across provinces and years. In Japan, too, confinement was used sparingly, for in many cases punishment took other forms. Yet when prisons were kept, they were simple, austere, designed to separate more than to torment. Straw mats on the floor, wooden slats in the walls, a stillness that pressed upon the spirit more than the body. The sound of wind through paper screens, the distant cry of a crow at dawn, these were the companions of the prisoner. Life outside was always so near, and yet so unreachable. If we travel again, this time toward the warm lands of the Mediterranean, we find other shapes of justice. In the great cities of Venice or Genoa, maritime republics whose wealth flowed from trade, prisons were often built into the very heart of civic buildings. The Palazzo Ducale in Venice, for instance, held beneath its grand chambers a network of cells, shadowy and damp, where those accused of crimes awaited trial. Imagine a prisoner lying beneath painted ceilings he could not see, beneath the sound of footsteps crossing marble halls above. The distance between splendor and silence only a matter of a few floors. In each of these places, the idea of prison reflected something of the culture itself. In Europe's feudal lands, confinement often meant uncertainty and gloom. Life paused in damp darkness. In Islamic lands, there was more often the sense of holding in patience, of waiting with some dignity intact, though hardship remained. In China, it was order and record, the vast arm of government stretching even into cells. And everywhere, there was the echo of the same truth, that freedom, once lost, left a mark upon the heart, no matter how the walls were shaped. We might pause here and listen. Hear the faint sound of voices reciting prayers in a courtyard prison. Hear the scratching of brushes on bamboo slips recording the name of a prisoner in China. Hear the lapping of water against the walls of Venice as a gondola passes near the Doge's palace. Each sound reminds us that prisons were not isolated things but part of the fabric of towns and cities, part of the way justice was woven into daily life. And yet, as we drift through these spaces, a question lingers. How did these different forms of confinement change the way prisoners lived within themselves? Did the man in the Venetian cell, hearing music in the square above, dream differently than the man in the damp pit of an English keep? Did the scholar detained in Baghdad pray with a different patience than the farmer held in a timber hall in France? These are questions without certain answers, yet they remind us that prisons were not just buildings, but experiences shaped by culture, by faith, by expectation. Soon, we will move closer again to the everyday details of prison life across these cultures, what prisoners ate, how they passed the long hours, how they marked time when days blurred into nights. But for now, let the journey rest upon your mind, like the soft turning of pages in a great book of the world. Imagine the courtyards, the cellars, the long halls of wood, the shadows beneath palaces, all part of a tapestry that stretches across centuries, and as you breathe slowly, let the thought of those walls fade into the night, leaving only the steady rhythm of your own breath like waves against a shore. For even as history holds us in its grasp, the present moment carries us gently toward rest. Imagine waking as the first light seeps faintly through a crack in the wall or through a barred slit of a window high above. The prisoner stirs upon his straw mat, his body stiff from the cold, his limbs aching from the hardness of the floor. Morning comes quietly in such a place without roosters crowing or bells chiming for the day's work. Instead, it comes with the sound of footsteps, the jailer moving down the corridor, the creak of a door, the rattle of keys. That sound, sharp and metallic, is the true dawn of the prison. Food is brought, though the word food is generous. In many places it was coarse bread, perhaps made of rye or barley, often hard at the edges and heavy in the stomach. Sometimes a bowl of thin broth or porridge was given, steaming faintly in the cool air. If families cared for the prisoner, richer meals might be sent in: cheese, a piece of fruit, even a little meat wrapped in cloth. These were treasures, not just for the body but for the spirit, a reminder that one was not forgotten beyond the walls. The taste of an apple, sweet and sharp, could linger in memory for days. Once the meal was done, the long hours began. For many, there was little to fill the day beyond waiting. Some prisoners prayed, whispering words softly in the dimness, counting beads if they had them, or tracing crosses upon the wall. Others told stories to one another, trading tales of life outside, of harvests and markets, of weddings and festivals long past. In these shared voices time passed more gently, the hours marked not by clocks but by the ebb and flow of conversation. There were small labours too. Some prisons allowed or even required work: weaving, mending nets, crafting simple objects. A man might sit in the corner with rough tools, shaping wood or twisting rope, his hands finding rhythm even as his mind wandered. Work could bring a little coin, or at least the sense of purpose that kept despair at bay. In some towns, prisoners sang or begged through the barred windows, their voices reaching the street, hoping for coins tossed from passers-by. The sound of such voices was part of the life of a town, a reminder to the free of the boundary that separated them from those within. The body grew restless in confinement. In prisons with yards or courtyards, a short walk might be granted, the prisoner stepping into sunlight for a brief time each day. The feel of the sky upon the face, the warmth of air upon the skin, was a comfort so powerful it could carry a man through another night. In darker places where no such mercy was allowed, the prisoner learned to walk small circles in the cell, pacing from wall to wall, counting steps like prayers, steadying the mind through motion. Water, too, was part of the rhythm. A jug was brought, sometimes once, sometimes twice a day. Washing was often rare, but when it came, even a handful of water poured over the hands felt cleansing, like a tiny rebirth. Some prisoners washed their faces in the faint trickle from cracks in the wall, letting drops run down their cheeks, savouring the coolness. Evening came slowly, signalled not by bells or sunset, but by the closing of doors, the rattle of chains, the last footsteps of the jailer. Supper, if it came, was often no more than bread again, perhaps a bit of broth left over from the day. After that, darkness gathered. A small candle might flicker, its flame watched carefully so as not to waste it. Shadows stretched across the walls, turning stone into something alive, shifting with each movement of the light. Night in prison was its own kind of world. The quiet was rarely complete. Coughs, snores, murmurs of prayer, the scrape of rats moving in corners. Yet amid these sounds the prisoner drifted into uneasy sleep, sometimes waking often, sometimes dreaming of open fields and familiar voices. Dreams became both comfort and torment, reminders of life beyond, of family, of freedom. In the morning the rhythm began again, the same sounds, the same meals, the same slow passing of time, and so the days wove together into a pattern: bread, water, waiting, silence, prayer, whispers, sleep. Within that pattern, prisoners made small rituals to keep themselves whole. A man might mark lines on the wall, counting the days. Another might carve shapes into wood, leaving traces of himself behind. A woman might braid her hair differently each morning, asserting some small control over her life. These tiny acts, almost invisible, were ways of saying, "I am still here." Beyond survival, the heart sought connection. Prisoners leaned close to walls to hear voices from other cells, tapped codes upon stone, passed notes in hidden ways. These quiet exchanges kept loneliness from deepening into despair. Even a single word whispered through a crack was enough to remind one that they were not alone in the shadows. And always, the greatest rhythm of all was hope. Hope that the next knock of the jailer's key would bring news of release, that the next visit from family would bring a letter, that the next festival might bring mercy. Hope hung in the air like a candle flame, trembling, sometimes dimming, but rarely extinguished. Now, as we leave these routines behind, let us pause in the stillness. Hear the quiet murmur of voices in the dark, the shuffle of straw, the faint creak of timber overhead. See the flicker of candlelight upon stone, the slow movement of shadows. Life in prison was narrow, yet within its narrowness people found ways to endure, to dream, to remain human. And as we drift forward, we shall step into another layer of this life, the role of faith and ritual, and how prayers, chapels, and sacred rites touched the souls of those behind the walls. But for now, rest gently in the rhythm of bread and water, of silence and whispers, of breath rising and falling in the quiet night. In the stillness of confinement, when hours blurred into one another and days seemed to stretch without end, many prisoners turned their thoughts upward. The body could be chained, but the spirit longed for something freer, something beyond the reach of keys and locks. Faith became both comfort and anchor, carrying men and women through the slow passing of time. Imagine a prisoner kneeling on the cold floor, hands folded, lips moving silently in prayer. No candle lights the cell, no priest stands nearby, yet in that moment the walls fade, and the soul feels lifted into a space greater than the dungeon's gloom. Prayer was rhythm, a way to mark time, as steady as the tolling of bells in a monastery or cathedral. Morning prayers, whispered at first light. Evening prayers, spoken when darkness settled again. All of these brought structure, weaving sacredness into even the bleakest day. In some prisons, chapels were built within the walls, small, simple rooms, often with little more than a cross of wood or stone, where prisoners gathered together. The sound of voices rose in unison, chanting psalms or hymns, filling the air with echoes that softened the hardness of stone. For a moment, in that collective murmur, the prison seemed less a place of separation and more a place of community, fragile but real. Priests and monks often visited, bringing not only the sacraments but words of consolation. They listened to confessions whispered through tears, offered absolution, spoke gently of mercy and forgiveness. For those awaiting trial or judgment, such words were like water upon parched lips, a reminder that even within human justice, divine compassion remained. Sometimes a condemned prisoner would spend his final nights in prayer with a priest, preparing his soul for what lay beyond. The prison cell, harsh though it was, became for him a chapel, a place of last reflection before the final journey. Faith was not only Christian, of course. In lands shaped by Islam, Prisoners recited verses from the Quran, their voices steady, their bodies turning toward Mecca, even in the narrow confines of a cell. The repetition of holy words steadied the heart, drawing strength from the rhythm of language and the certainty of tradition. In some places, scholars confined for political reasons continued to teach from memory, passing on wisdom to fellow prisoners, transforming their captivity into a kind of school of patience and endurance. Whatever the faith, ritual became a lifeline. To kneel, to bow, to recite familiar words. These were acts of reclaiming humanity, of remembering one's place in the larger weave of the world. Even those less devout often found themselves praying in prison, for desperation draws the soul toward hope, and hope often wears the face of the divine. Symbols carried power too. A rosary bead passed from hand to hand, a small cross scratched into stone, a verse written upon a scrap of parchment. These objects became treasures. They reminded the prisoner that he or she was not abandoned, that others had walked the same path of confinement and found light in the shadows. A small cross carved into the wall might outlast the prisoner himself, remaining for years as a silent testimony of faith. Festivals and holy days were marked even behind bars. At Christmas, candles flickered where they could, prayers rose louder, and sometimes, if mercy touched the hearts of rulers, prisoners were released in honor of the holy day. In Ramadan, fasts were kept even in the hunger of confinement, the breaking of the fast at sunset bringing comfort in the shared moment of ritual. The cycle of sacred time carried on, unbroken by the walls, reminding prisoners that the world beyond still turned, and they were still part of it. Faith also offered hope of justice greater than that of men. A prisoner wrongfully accused might find strength in believing that God knew the truth, even if earthly courts did not. A guilty man might seek forgiveness, finding in prayer a release that no jailer could grant. The prison, for all its cruelty, sometimes became a place of spiritual awakening, where silence and suffering stripped life down to its essence, leaving only the soul and its search for meaning. And when despair pressed too heavily, when the weight of stone seemed too much to bear, prayer was a lullaby, a soft murmur that calmed the mind. Just as a child listens to a mother's song and drifts into sleep, so too did prisoners murmur sacred words to soothe their fears, to quiet the pounding of the heart, to remind themselves that beyond the walls lay not only freedom, but eternity. So let us leave this moment with an image. A small group of prisoners, kneeling together in a chapel carved into the heart of a fortress, their voices low but steady. Above them, unseen, soldiers walk the battlements, and outside, the world bustles with trade and laughter. But here, in the glow of a single candle, faith holds them still, like a soft hand upon the shoulder. The walls are high, the locks are strong, but the spirit drifts beyond them, into something greater. Soon, we shall step into another part of prison life, the punishments and disciplines that lay just beyond daily routine, not in sharp cruelty, but in the quiet rules that shaped behavior and kept order. Yet for now, let us rest in this calm, where prayer and song echo softly, carrying the heart into gentle peace. Inside the medieval prison, silence was never quite complete, yet disorder was never allowed to spread too far. Even in places where the jailer cared little, some kind of discipline was necessary, for without it, confinement would become chaos. And so rules, both spoken and unspoken, wove through the life of every prisoner. The first rule was obedience. When the jailer entered, keys jangling at his side, prisoners lowered their eyes, stepped back, made space. His word carried weight, not only because he held the power of doors and chains, but because defiance could bring swift correction. Correction did not always mean harsh beating, though such things did occur. But often, smaller punishments, subtle but heavy in their own way. Imagine a prisoner who speaks out too loudly, his words carrying anger or insult. The jailer, displeased, might take away his straw, forcing him to lie on bare stone. Another might be denied visits, left without the comfort of a familiar face or the gifts of food and clothing that families so often brought. Still another could be moved to a darker cell, away from the thin shaft of light he had grown used to. These punishments were not bloody, but they pressed heavily upon the spirit, reminding the prisoner that life could always grow more difficult. Even within the narrow bounds of captivity, there were rules about food as well. Meals were shared in order, sometimes with bowls passed carefully along, sometimes with bread divided by hand. A greedy man who tried to take more than his portion might find himself cut off, the jailer's eyes cold upon him. Hunger was punishment enough. To make it worse was a lesson in obedience. Silence, too, was a rule. At night, when candles were snuffed and the doors closed, loud voices were forbidden. A man who sang too loudly or shouted across the corridor might find himself chained more tightly the next day. Quiet was both necessity and expectation, for it kept the prison from erupting into unrest. In some places, a bell or a shout from the jailer marked, "When talking must cease," leaving only the sound of breathing, of straw shifting, of rats in the corners. There were rules about movement. A prisoner was not to wander without leave, not to step beyond a threshold unless called. In castles where stairs wound downward into dungeons, the jailer sometimes left a chain stretched across a passage, a silent reminder that the way forward was forbidden. In town jails, doors were barred not only with wood, but with custom. Everyone knew where they were meant to stand, to sit, to lie. Yet discipline was not only the work of jailers. Prisoners too created their own rules born of necessity. In a crowded cell there had to be agreements. Who lay nearest the wall, who slept near the draughty door, who kept watch when food was divided. These unspoken agreements were fragile but important. To break them risked quarrel, and quarrel risked punishment for all. So even in the dimness, order was maintained, not through law written on parchment, but through quiet understanding forged by shared suffering. There were also rituals of respect. A newcomer to the prison might be tested by the others, watched closely to see if he would honor the ways already set. Would he share his food or hoard it? Would he speak kindly or shout too often? In this way, small communities formed, bound not by affection, but by the necessity of order. Within such communities, small leaders arose, men who had been there longest, who knew the jailer's moods, who could smooth quarrels before they grew. Their word carried weight, sometimes more than the jailer's own, for it was spoken in the language of those who shared the darkness. When rules were broken beyond repair, punishment sometimes grew sharper. Stocks could be used within prison walls, holding a man fast in an uncomfortable position. Chains could be shortened, allowing less movement. In rare cases, the jailer might even refuse food for a day, teaching obedience through hunger. These were heavy measures, but they were meant to remind all that discipline was as much a part of prison life as walls and locks. Yet discipline was not always cruel. At times, the rules themselves gave a strange sense of comfort. In a life where days blurred and hope was faint, the presence of order reminded prisoners that there was still structure, still some thread of meaning woven into the long hours. To rise when the jailer called, to eat when the food was given, to lie down when the doors closed. These things, though imposed, brought rhythm to lives that might otherwise have dissolved into despair. And above it all, there was the great rule of patience. To survive, one had to endure. The prisoner learned to measure his words, to quiet his anger, to wait through the days with as much calm as possible. The discipline of the prison was not only enforced from outside, but cultivated within, as men and women taught themselves to breathe slowly, to steady their hearts, to hold on to the thought of tomorrow. Now, as we leave these rules behind, let us pause in the quiet. Hear the footsteps fading down the corridor, the last clatter of keys, the silence that settles after discipline has been kept. Life within the walls was narrow, but order allowed it to continue, day after day, until judgment came. Soon, we will step into another part of this story, the visitors and families who brought comfort into the darkness, carrying food, clothing, and news from the world beyond. But for now, let your breath fall gently into its own rhythm, steady and calm, like the slow passing of time within stone walls. Though prisons were meant to separate, they were never entirely sealed. Life outside always found ways to press against the walls, carried by voices, footsteps, and the gifts of those who cared for the people within. In truth, many prisoners would not have survived without their families, for the food given by jailers was often meagre, rough bread, or thin broth, scarcely enough to keep a body strong. Visitors, therefore, became lifelines, carrying baskets of food, jars of drink, blankets, and sometimes even a few coins to ease the burden of confinement. Picture a narrow doorway, the heavy iron latch lifted for a moment as a woman enters with a bundle at her side. She has walked from the market, her basket filled with bread, still warm from the oven, or with salted fish wrapped in cloth. Perhaps she brings a little fruit in the summer, or dried herbs in the winter, each gift chosen with care. She hands these things to the jailer, who inspects them with slow, practiced eyes. A coin might pass from her hand to his, a quiet bargain to ensure the prisoner receives the gifts unharmed. Only then does the basket move through the doorway into the shadowed place beyond. For the prisoner, to see the face of a loved one was more nourishing than food itself. Families were sometimes allowed to speak for a few moments, voices hushed, words hurried, before the jailer's frown ended the meeting. In those brief moments, the prisoner might hear news of the harvest, of children growing, of neighbors asking after him. Even a handful of such words was enough to remind him that he was not forgotten, that beyond the walls, life still waited. Not all visits were from family. Sometimes friends came, bringing letters or small comforts. A scrap of writing folded carefully could be read again and again in the dim light, the words taking on a power far greater than their size. In an age when books were precious and few could write, even a single line in familiar handwriting was treasure. There were also visits from strangers, men and women moved by piety or kindness. Monks and nuns sometimes brought food and comfort, speaking softly to those most in despair. In some towns, charitable societies were formed to help prisoners, collecting alms to pay their debts or ease their suffering. A loaf of bread given in charity could mean the difference between hunger and hope. Children, too, sometimes entered those places. A small child clinging to her mother's hand, peering wide-eyed at the darkness, perhaps offering her father a flower plucked from the roadside. Such moments were fleeting, yet they lingered in memory long after, like sunlight carried into a dream. Visits were not always tender, of course. Sometimes quarrels spilled into the prison. Angry words about unpaid debts, disputes over property, or betrayals that had led to imprisonment in the first place. Yet even these encounters showed how closely tied the prison was to the world outside. No one inside was truly cut off. Threads of family, friendship, and conflict continued to bind them, no matter how heavy the locks. There was another kind of visitor too, one whose presence carried more weight. The lawyer or the advocate, or perhaps a messenger from the court. These visits were filled with tension, as the prisoner leaned forward to hear what fate might soon be decided. Words of hope or despair could fall like stones into the stillness of a cell. Yet even here, the presence of someone from beyond reminded the prisoner that life outside still moved, and his place within it was not entirely erased. Visitors brought more than food and news. They carried the warmth of touch, a hand pressed through the bars, fingers brushing fingers, a kiss given hurriedly on a cheek before the jailer called time. Such gestures were fragile, fleeting, yet they lingered in memory long after, like the echo of a song. For the jailers, visits were both burden and benefit. They brought work, inspection, and negotiation, but they also brought profit, for many jailers relied on fees and small payments from visitors. To allow a meeting, to carry food safely, to deliver a message, all these could be reasons to demand coin. Harsh though it may seem, it was part of the rhythm of the prison, a system everyone understood. Families paid because they must, and jailers accepted because it was expected. In this way, the prison became not only a place of punishment, but a place of exchange, where human ties and human needs crossed the boundaries of law. Sometimes, the presence of families softened even the jailer's heart. A kind word spoken to a child, a loaf of bread left untouched by greedy hands, a small moment of mercy shown when none was required. These things did happen, quietly, without record. Even in the sternest of places, kindness could slip through, carried on the warmth of human connection. So let us pause with this image. A prisoner sitting in his cell, the taste of fresh bread still on his tongue, the sound of his wife's voice still in his ears, the touch of his child's hand still lingering in memory. Around him the walls remain unbroken, the locks remain secure. Yet in his heart a little light has entered, carried by those who stepped across the threshold for a moment, bringing the world inside. Soon we will wander into another part of this story. The markets that grew around prisons, the bustling exchange of food, goods, and coin that surrounded these dark places like a curious shadow of everyday life. But for now, let the thought of family comfort linger, soft as a blanket drawn close, steady as a heartbeat heard in the quiet night. For though the prison was a place of darkness, outside its gates life carried on with noise and colour, and sometimes the two mingled in curious ways. The prison drew people, families, merchants, guards, even the idle curious, and wherever people gathered, markets were sure to follow. Imagine the narrow street leading up to a stone gatehouse, the air filled with the mingled smells of bread baking, ale brewing, leather curing in the sun. Small stalls pressed close together, wooden boards set across barrels, cloth awnings stretched to keep off the rain. Merchants knew well that those who came to visit prisoners often lingered outside, needing food, lodging, or goods to carry inside. A woman might stop to buy a small loaf or a jug of beer before stepping through the gate, her coins clinking softly as she haggled with the seller. A boy carrying a basket might pause to purchase an apple or a scrap of cloth, both for himself and for the one waiting in the dimness beyond the wall. In this way, the prison and the market lived side by side, each feeding the other. There were sellers of bread, their loaves round and crusty, warm from the ovens. Bakers sometimes baked extra loaves, especially for the families of prisoners, knowing that hungry mouths waited beyond the barred doors. There were butchers, too, offering salted meat or small cuts wrapped in cloth. Fishmongers called out softly, their voices carrying the smell of river or sea, their baskets glistening with scales. For those with a little more coin, spiced wine or sweetmeats could be bought, rare treats to brighten a prisoner's meal and remind him of home. But it was not only food. Traders sold blankets, rough woolen cloaks, straw for bedding, candles for light. Families often had to provide these things themselves, for the jailer's care was thin. Imagine a wife choosing a thick blanket, folding it carefully, and thinking of her husband lying on cold stone. A small act of love purchased among the noise of the marketplace, carried inward as a gift of warmth. There were scribes who sat with quills and ink, offering to write letters for those who could not read or write. A mother might dictate a few tender lines, her words scratched onto parchment, folded and sealed with wax. For a prisoner who received it, such a letter was more precious than gold. The market was full of voices like these, voices of trade, voices of comfort, voices carrying human hope across the threshold of confinement. And not all who gathered came for love. Some came for curiosity, drawn by the presence of the prison itself. They whispered of who was held inside, of what crimes were said to have been committed, of what judgment might soon fall. Rumours passed like coins from hand to hand, traded along with bread and ale. For the townsfolk, the prison was both shadow and spectacle, a reminder of justice and a source of endless tales. Children darted between the stalls, chasing each other, their laughter carrying strangely near the grim walls. Perhaps they peered up at the barred windows, wondering if eyes were watching from within. To them the prison was mysterious, a place half feared and half fascinating, always present in the rhythm of their games. For the jailers, too, the market was a blessing. They could step outside, purchase their meals, or profit quietly from deals with merchants. Some even let favoured sellers inside to trade directly with prisoners, turning corridors into narrow markets where coins exchanged hands in the flicker of torchlight. In this way, the prison and the market blurred together, each depending on the other in ways both practical and human. As the day waned, torches flickered in the stalls, their flames dancing in the evening air. The murmur of bargaining softened into the low hum of song as alehouses near the prison filled with voices. Families who had come far to visit might spend the night in nearby lodgings, their thoughts heavy but softened by the comfort of food and rest. The prison, though a place of shadows, thus sustained a ring of life around it. Bakers, sellers, scribes, children and strangers, all woven into its story, and so we leave this picture, a prison standing firm in stone, but at its gates a market alive with sound and colour, a place where humanity pressed close, refusing to be entirely kept out. Life always clung near the walls, just as hope always clung in the hearts of those within. Soon, we will turn to another corner of this world, the role of debt. For many who filled the prisons of medieval towns were not murderers or thieves, but simple folk who had fallen behind on payments, whose poverty became their chain. We will see how prisons became not only houses of punishment, but houses of debt, and how this shaped lives across centuries. But for now, let the gentle murmur of the market linger in your ears, soft and steady, as though you are drifting among the stalls with nothing but time. In the towns of Europe, money was as binding as any chain. A man who borrowed from his neighbour or who promised payment for grain, cloth or land carried more than a bargain on his shoulders. If fortune failed him, if the harvest was poor, if trade went badly, if illness swept through his family, then the weight of debt grew heavier and heavier, until it could bring him to the very threshold of the prison gates. Imagine a craftsman in a narrow street, his workshop filled with wood shavings or the smell of leather. For months he has worked hard, yet his customers pay slowly, and his creditors knock at the door. He borrows coin to keep his family fed, believing he will repay soon. But time passes and the debt grows. One day the law comes not for his tools, but for his body. He is led away, not for stealing, not for harming, but for owing. Behind him, his wife and children watch in silence, their world falling into shadow. Debtors' prisons were crowded places. Men sat shoulder to shoulder, not criminals by nature, but simply poor or unlucky. Some were merchants who had taken risks in trade and failed. Others were farmers crushed by taxes or bad harvests. Still others were labourers who could not pay small fines or rents. In their cells they spoke not of theft or murder, but of loans and payments, of bargains struck and broken. Money, or the lack of it, became the chain that bound them. The cruelest part was that prison did not ease the debt. A man confined could not work, and so his family struggled even more. Wives took to washing clothes, begging in markets, or selling what little they owned just to survive. Children grew hungry, their shoes worn thin, their faces pale. Sometimes they carried food to the prison, handing bread through the bars, hoping to keep their father alive long enough for freedom to return. And yet within the gloom, a strange market of debt continued. Creditors might visit, bargaining still. "Pay this much," they would say, "and you may go free." Some prisoners managed to negotiate, sending word to relatives or friends to gather coins on their behalf. Others waited for charitable guilds or religious orders to step in. In some towns, societies existed whose sole purpose was to ransom debtors, collecting alms from the community to pay what could not be paid. For the fortunate, such mercy opened the door. For the less fortunate, the days turned into months and months into years. Life as a debtor-prisoner was marked by idleness, but also by endless talk. Men repeated their stories to one another, telling and retelling how they had fallen into debt, how they hoped to escape it, how unjust the law seemed. These stories were like lullabies, soothing in repetition, keeping despair at bay. And always there was the hope that tomorrow a messenger might arrive with coin, with news, with release. The walls of debtors' prisons were not always grim stone. In some towns they were lighter places, with prisoners allowed to move more freely, to talk with visitors, even to step outside under guard. Yet the shame of debt was as heavy as the walls of any dungeon. To owe was to be marked, to be seen as careless or dishonest, even when misfortune was the true cause. Prison became a place not only of confinement but of humiliation. Still the human spirit endured. Debtors carved little games into the stone, played with scraps of wood or bone, passed songs and stories from one to another. Some wrote letters to loved ones, carefully folded and smuggled out. Others prayed, not only for freedom, but for their families, left to bear the greater burden outside. In this way, even within poverty and confinement, life continued, fragile but steady, like a candle that refuses to go out. Let us hold. For a moment the image of a debtor sitting in his cell, a scrap of parchment in his hand, written by his child. The words are simple, shaky, but they tell him of home, of a garden where flowers still bloom, of a mother who waits with hope. He presses the letter to his chest, closing his eyes. Around him, the murmur of other voices rises and falls, but in his heart he holds the sound of his child's laughter, bright and free. Soon we will turn to another path in this story. The prisons not for debt or crime, but for politics, where nobles and thinkers found themselves confined, their fates tied not to poverty but to power. Yet for now let the quiet weight of the debtor's tale settle gently, reminding us that prisons were filled not only with the guilty, but with the unlucky, the poor, and the vulnerable, whose only crime was misfortune. Not all prisoners of the medieval world were poor or nameless. Some were men and women of stature, caught in the shifting tides of politics. When kingdoms clashed, when lords quarrelled with kings, when voices rose against the crown, prisons filled with those who had once walked proudly through courts and halls. Their cells were not always the damp dungeons of common law, but chambers in towers, guarded rooms in castles, places where confinement was softened by rank, yet still heavy with uncertainty. Imagine a nobleman, once dressed in silk, now seated in a chamber where the walls are bare stone. He has a window, perhaps, looking out over the countryside he once ruled. His meals are brought by servants finer than the crusts of the poor, yet seasoned with bitterness, for freedom is gone. He writes letters, his hand moving carefully across parchment, sending pleas to allies, whispers of hope to family. Each word passes through the eyes of a jailer, yet still he writes, for words are the only wings left to him. Political prisoners often lived in a strange half-world. They were confined but not forgotten. Guards watched them closely, but visitors came, envoys, relatives, sometimes even spies disguised as friends. These visits were heavy with whispers, for the fate of a prisoner of rank could shift kingdoms. To release him might strengthen a rival. To keep him locked away might fan rebellion. His presence in prison was not only punishment, but symbol, a reminder to all of what power could do. Some were treated with surprising courtesy. Captive kings or high lords were housed in comfort, allowed servants, given books, permitted to walk in gardens within their confinement. They lived as shadows of themselves, their chains invisible but no less real. Others, though noble, were held in harsher ways, placed in towers or even dungeons when suspicion was great. To be high-born was no shield when a crown felt threatened. The Tower of London became such a place, its walls echoing with the steps of princes, bishops and councillors who had fallen from grace. Within its chambers, plots were remembered, letters smuggled, hopes whispered in the dark. A prisoner might pace beneath high stone arches, hearing the footsteps of guards above, dreaming of freedom beyond the Thames. The tower was both fortress and cage, witness to centuries of political fortune. But political prisoners were not only nobles. Thinkers, writers, and reformers too sometimes found themselves confined. A man who spoke too boldly against authority, who questioned the order of church or crown, could be silenced by stone walls. Yet even in confinement, words found ways to slip free. Manuscripts were written in secret, poems scratched upon walls, ideas carried beyond the gates by trusted friends. In this way, prisons became strange cradles of thought, holding the seeds of change even as they sought to bury them. There was also the peculiar fate of hostages, for in medieval times important men and sometimes even children were held not for crimes but as sureties of peace. A noble family might leave a son in the care of a rival lord to guarantee a treaty. The boy grew up behind walls, not as a criminal, but as a living promise. His days might be filled with learning, with the company of guards and tutors, yet his heart longed for home. Such captivity was softer than dungeon life, yet it carried its own sorrow, for it was captivity all the same. And then there were prisoners of war, nobles captured on the battlefield. For them, prison was often a waiting place for ransom. Wealthy families or kingdoms sent gold to secure their release, and until that moment, they lived in careful custody. Some were treated almost as honored guests, dining with their captors, walking under guard, awaiting the day when coin would buy their freedom. But beneath the courtesy lay the same truth. Their fate rested not in their own hands, but in the will of others. Let us pause and picture one such prisoner. A lord confined in a high tower, his window open to the sky. He gazes out at the fields below, the distant forests, the river winding away into the horizon. Birds wheel past his window, free to come and go. His heart aches at the sight, yet he does not despair. He dreams of the day when doors will open, when he will ride again with banner and sword. Until then he waits, each day marked by letters, by whispered visits, by the steady ticking of time. Soon we will turn our gaze to the afterlives of prisoners, to what awaited them when doors finally opened. Freedom for some, exile for others, and sometimes the silence of death. But for now, let this image rest in your mind, a prisoner of power seated in a chamber of stone, half lord, half captive, his life balanced on the edge of history. For every man or woman held behind walls, there came a day when the waiting ended. Some were led to freedom, others to exile, still others to the silence of death. The prison was never a place to stay forever. It was a holding ground, a pause in the story before life moved forward again in one of many directions. Imagine the moment of release. A prisoner who has waited through long nights hears at last the sound of keys turning not for another inspection, not for another tightening of rules, but for his freedom. The door swings open, the jailer steps aside, and light pours in from the world beyond. The prisoner blinks, his eyes unused to brightness, his body stiff from confinement. Yet his feet carry him forward, out into air that smells of earth and wind, air that tastes of life. Families sometimes waited just outside, arms open, voices trembling with joy. A wife embracing her husband, children clinging to their father's legs, tears falling freely. The weight of prison slipped away in that embrace, though its memory lingered always in the heart. But not all who left the prison walked into such joy. Some left in exile, ordered never to return to their homes. They were given passage, sometimes across seas, sometimes across borders, and their freedom was tinged with sorrow, for they were free of walls but bound to distance. To step into exile was to carry the ache of separation, to live forever as an echo of what had been lost. Others walked out not through mercy, but through justice carried to its end. The judgment of death was sometimes pronounced, and the prisoner, after his final prayers, was led from the cell into the world one last time. These endings were spoken of in whispers, remembered more for the solemn march than for the act itself, for in our telling we leave behind the harshness, holding only the quiet dignity of a soul meeting its fate. For such men and women, the prison was a waiting room between life and the beyond. There were also those whose release came not through mercy or coin, but through the slow erosion of time. Their sentences ended, their debts were paid, their punishment fulfilled. For them, the walk from prison was heavy with change, for the world outside had shifted. Shops had new owners, neighbors had grown old, children had become adults. Freedom felt strange, like waking from a long dream to find that everything familiar had changed. Some adapted, building lives again with patience and strength. Others found the world too altered, too cold, and longed for the strange familiarity of the prison walls. And then there were those who left in silence, carried out not by their own steps but by others. Illness was common within the prisons, and many lives ended quietly in straw-lined corners. For these, the prison became their final resting place, their names sometimes forgotten, their graves unmarked. Yet even in their passing, whispers of them remained, carried by family, by records, by memory. For some, freedom came not from judgment, but from escape. Tunnels dug with spoons, ropes knotted from sheets, bribes paid to guards. These stories flickered like firelight in the imagination of all who remained behind. Few succeeded, but those who did became tales retold in taverns and around hearths, legends of cleverness and daring. The thought of escape was, for many, a lullaby of hope, even if only a dream. The afterlives of prisoners carried lessons for the living. To the townsfolk, they were reminders of justice, of mercy, of fortune's fickleness. To the families, they were scars and memories, softening with time but never erased. And to the prisoners themselves, whether freed, exiled, or remembered, the experience of confinement lingered always, shaping the way they walked through the rest of their days. Let us pause with an image. A man stepping out of prison after years away, the sun warm on his face, the sound of birds in the trees. He closes his eyes and breathes deeply, savoring the simplest of joys, the feel of grass beneath his feet, the open sky above. Around him, life bustles on, indifferent yet eternal, and he walks into it slowly, carrying both his past and his newfound freedom. Soon, we will wander into one final stretch of our story, drawing together the threads of everything we have seen, the walls and doors, the lives within, the families outside, the markets, the prayers, the punishments, the hopes. We will let the tale come to rest as softly as it began, like a door closing, not in harshness, but in peace. But for now, let this moment of release settle gently. like a sigh at the end of a long day. We have wandered far through the stone corridors of medieval prisons, listening to the echo of footsteps, the murmur of voices, the soft rustle of straw in the dark. We have stood with prisoners as the heavy doors closed behind them, felt the chill of stone against the skin, and watched the slow passage of time in silence and shadow. We have seen how life unfolded within those walls, the simple rituals of waking, eating, speaking, praying, and waiting, and how, even in confinement, the human spirit sought rhythm and meaning. We have followed the jailers, their keys heavy at their sides, men who walked between two worlds, sometimes cruel, sometimes kind, always holding the delicate balance of order. We have listened to the whispers of families who came with baskets of food and words of comfort, carrying love into the darkest corners. We have wandered into the markets that bloomed outside the gates, where bread was sold, letters written, and news exchanged, showing us that even the harshest places were never fully cut off from life. We have sat among the debtors, men whose only crime was poverty, whose chains were made of misfortune more than malice. We have walked with nobles and thinkers, confined in towers for their politics or their ideas, their lives tied to the great struggles of kingdoms. We have watched the faithful bow their heads in prayer, turning their cells into chapels, their whispers into songs of endurance. We have seen rules enforced and broken, punishments given, small comforts shared, communities formed in the shadows, and then we have stepped with them into the moments when prison ended. Freedom bright as sunlight, exile heavy with sorrow, death solemn and quiet, escape daring and rare. Each ending different, yet all carrying the same truth. That prison was never a world entire, but a passage, a pause, a place where life was held, reshaped, and released again. What then do these old prisons teach us? Perhaps that justice has always been complicated, tangled in law, poverty, and power. Perhaps that confinement, though cruel, cannot wholly extinguish hope, for the human heart always seeks light, even in the darkest cell. Perhaps that even where walls are thickest, the bonds of love, faith, and memory find ways to cross. Let us leave this story with a final image. A medieval prison stands in the heart of a town, its walls rough with age, its windows narrow and dark. Inside voices murmur, some in prayer, some in talk, some in quiet weeping. Outside, life moves on, the market hums, children play, church bells ring. The prison is both part of the town and apart from it, a shadow in the midst of life, holding its share of sorrow and resilience. Now the doors close gently behind us, not in fear, but in peace. We step back into the night, leaving behind the whispers of the prisoners, the clatter of keys, the flicker of torchlight. The story rests like a book closing softly, its pages filled with memory and humanity. And as you drift now toward your own rest, let the thought settle lightly. That history, even in its darkest corners, carries not only pain, but endurance, tenderness, and the quiet strength of the human spirit. The prison walls are behind us, the night is calm, and the road ahead is open. Sleep well and dream gently,